The Reserve Bank has dropped its shoulder like a loose forward smashing through a ruck. OCR is at 3% and dropping. Mortgage rates are tumbling and the Kiwi dollar wobbling like the Black Caps tail enders.
By God, what a ripper!
Everyone's talking about stimulus like it's some tactical masterstroke. But is this really a winning game plan, or are we just setting ourselves up for another season of property chaos? Westpac Chief Economist Kelly Eckhold is here to call the play. He's next.
Financial freedom faster. Financial freedom faster.
Now, if you actually fancy making money instead of sitting there sulking while your neighbours get rich and keep refreshing Trade Me like some tragic hobby, hit the subscribe button. More Kiwis are choosing to get their property brains from this YouTube show than anywhere else in 2025. Be a trendsetter before your mates find out. Kelly, straight off, is a 2.5% OCR the Reserve Bank's Hail Mary or just a well-drilled set move?
Well, it's certainly an element of a Hail Mary, because I think one of the things happened is that the Reserve Bank lost a bit of patience with how fast the recovery was going to proceed. So they moved off this idea that they were going to slow down the pace of easings and maybe finish up somewhere closer to 3%. Now they're talking about 2.5%. I think that will put interest rates squarely into stimulatory territory. Particularly since I think a sort of like an even sort of like neutral rate is probably closer to 3.375%. Reserve Bank not quite that optimistic. They sort of thought that somewhere in the 3 to 3.5% range was about neutral, but I think we can all agree at 2.5% that's going to be adding something into the mix.
So looking at the Kiwi dollar, it's been hammered, which obviously is great news for exporters, but not so good for importers. Petrol seems pretty cheap at the moment comparatively, but it's inflationary, isn't it? And this is the problem, that with the Reserve Bank and the CPI next month, we don't want it, or they're not allowed to let it rise above 3%.
Yeah, they've accepted that it's going to, because it's so short a time period now between when that data is going to come and when they can have any influence on it, that they've accepted that it's going to be 3% in the September quarter. We actually think it'll be a bit higher than that, be closer to 3.1%, and we think it'll still be there in the fourth quarter as well. The story they're telling us is they're looking forward a year or so from now and saying, well, our forecasts say that I'll be at about 2.2%, which is close enough to 2%. So therefore, they think they've got the room to do the cuts.
Now, when that Bolger government came in and put the Reserve Bank policy up to 3%, I can't remember a government in 30 years actually going, or Reserve Bank and inflation going above 3%. It was the talk of the world. And of course, what happened with COVID, suddenly our expectations are, it can go over the Reserve Bank's policy of 3%. But isn't this historically unusual that they accept it going over 3% and shrug their shoulders?
It certainly is a bit unusual. Normally, they're not that keen on taking risks like that. But I guess, they're looking at this quite long period that we've had unemployment rising, the fact that we seem to have had a bit of a setback for growth in the second quarter of this year. They've forecasted that it would go down by 0.3% for that quarter. And now that we've got all of our updated indicators for Q2, we would tend to agree that it looks like a bit like that. Some of that is to do with the vagaries of the statistician's pen, as opposed to kind of like actual economic output. But it does sort of look to them like there's a bit of a hole that the economy's fallen into that they need to fill in.
Yes, so are we genuinely stimulating the economy yet? Because the OCR keeps coming down and I'm not seeing it.
So I think we are, but we have to remember that there's still quite a bit to flow through. So if I look at that 2.5% OCR, where it'll end up at Christmas, according to the forecasts, well, based off the mortgage rates, we'd say we're probably only seen about 40% of the total pass through into people's budgets right now. So when you say you're not feeling it, I can understand that, because, there's a few people out there sort of still waiting to kind of roll on to the lower rates. And even I noticed for business lenders, their interest rates are usually tied a bit more closely to the 90-day rate, which is tied to the OCR. But even there, it would suggest to me there's probably perhaps 0.75% of extra easing that's going to hit their balance sheets by the end of the year. So I guess the message of that is that there's a bit of stimulus still in the pipeline.
Okay, but I'm going to flip it on its head because at the start of the year, Economist was saying that I think 81% of New Zealand mortgage owners were coming off mortgages.
Yep.
So is it really going to flow through because people will have refixed?
So what happened up until probably sort of February this year is a lot of people were just refixing for 6 months. So that's why when we look at the data now, if I look at through from here until the next 6 months, it's still the case that there's about 50 or 60% of people repricing. So because people have played this game of just rolling short, it means that they're only slowly getting the benefit of all of the rate cuts that are occurring.
So when do we actually start seeing results, in jobs, wages, and growth, and not just in house prices?
Yeah, well, housing is a bit of a story in itself right now, but in terms of the broader economy, we do think we're going to get positive growth in Q3 or Q4. So we think this negative dip in Q2 is going to be an aberration rather than the trend. 2026 is definitely destined to be much better times. And I think the thing there is that the lags to monetary policy, we always say that it's like 18 months from when the cuts happen to when you get the maximum impact. And, we're just over 12 months from the first one. So it's sort of well within the range of the expectations that we generally have. It's just that when you're going through it, it just seems like it's taking a long time. The other thing I'll add is that the labour market, it has been quite flat. We're expecting that once we get closer to Christmas, it'll actually be a lot more positive. And when people start to see that in their daily lives, we think that will be associated with them spending a bit more and businesses investing a bit more as well.
Let me play the devil's advocate here. We were doing podcasts this time last year where everyone's saying just survive till 2025, and you're saying essentially the same thing. So I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying what's really happened. Nothing's happened in 12 months.
Yeah, so it's a good point, right? Because it survived to 25. Sort of the broad story that there was going to be recovery has been something that's been seen in the forecast for a while. What I will say is in the fourth quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year, we did actually get our expectations in terms of what we thought was going to happen. So what's happened in the second quarter? Well, one of the factors I point to is the uncertainty around Donald Trump and the pretty exceptional things that he's delivered into the global economy since then. And we never forecast shocks like that. You kind of can't. It's like now, if I told you that a downside risk is that there's a war between Russia and Europe erupt based off some of the things that have been going on in Polish airspace in the last 24 hours. You would have to say that it would be a bit of a fringe view, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen. And if those sort of things do happen, then the whole outlook shifts.
Yes, but I would argue that we knew when Trump came into power that tariffs were going to come along. And he's unusual because he's just the second president ever to be elected 2 terms, but not concurrently. And so we knew what we were getting in the second term. And so you look at commentators like Bill Maher, for example, or Jon Stewart, they're not overreacting like normal. He's not dominating the news like he did. Okay, he's making changes, but when it's not as bad as the first term when we just sat there going, what the hell is going on?
There is a strong element of us understanding more as he's doing things, how he does business. But if you think about the first bit of this year, financial markets were actually quite complacent about tariffs and how that was going to, how bad it was going to be and how it was going to impact the world economy. Certainly in New Zealand, there wasn't really that much talk about a big impact here. But what we have actually seen happen since then is that he's increased tariffs by about 15 or 16 percentage points, which you haven't seen that sort of increase, in probably 200 or 300 years, and it takes you back to where you were in the 1930s. I think a lot of people at the start of the year accepted that he would probably put some tariffs on, but they'd be a lot more targeted than they have been. And I think this is one thing that people have really...
I don't understand it. Like even in his book, The Art of the Deal, he's always been obsessed with tariffs. I think that the thing that is interesting, because he's very easy to read, is he's currently putting pressure on the Fed. And he's behaving like a king, and everything he's done so far with every other government department, even the courts, he seems to have got his way, and he's putting pressure on the Fed because he wants to drop interest rates. And that's the next thing that's going to be interesting, because that will affect us.
Yeah, I mean, these are good points. And, I think the thing that has surprised everybody is just how much control Trump has had over Congress, over institutions. Part of the reason for that kind of more sanguine view, sort of from 6 and 9 months ago, was the idea that, yes, he's written it in his book, but he's not going to be allowed to do all of these things. Now, people are really rethinking that, even to the extent to which people are suggesting that he may be able to direct the Fed to do something with interest rates that you wouldn't have thought that they would do.
Yeah, and if that happens, that's where New Zealand will really feel it, because that will have an effect throughout the world.
Yeah, well, I think one of the real challenges that the world and New Zealand is going to have to face with what's going on with, particularly in the US, is the idea that you might end up with lower short-term interest rates, but higher long-term interest rates, and also quite volatile exchange rates out of all of this. So that is going to be a real challenge, I think. If you think about in the housing market where longer-term mortgage rates are driven off long-term wholesale rates, some of that is coming off what the OCR is doing here, but actually quite a decent amount of it comes off the global environment. And a lot of analysts right now would say that this is an environment where there's going to be risk premia built into longer term rates, which means that those rates don't fall as much as you would otherwise think. So I think it's definitely going to be a factor that will be impinging on consumers and businesses as we go through next year.
And that's happening already, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
The banks are factoring that in and going to OCR 2.5%. We're not going to wait till Christmas for big jumps. The banks are going to factor it in already.
You can certainly see it sort of like in the difference between what short-term and long-term interest rates have been doing in the last few months. I mean, we have a very steep yield curve in New Zealand right now. What that's telling you is the markets are suggesting that even if the OCR goes to 2.5, it's not going to stay there for, say, 5 or 10 years. It probably realistically around a 4% interest rate is probably closer to the mark in terms of where it might average out.
Chief Economist at Westpac, Kelly Eckhold, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Before we go, you don't need another pep talk. You're not a toddler learning to walk. You're an adult trying to buy property in a country where a garden shed costs more than your first marriage. What you need? Ammunition. Moves that actually work. Tactics that don't require a seminar, a vision board, or a motivational playlist. The 3 Property Workshop, the 3 Property Formula, is what smart Kiwis are using right now, while the rest are still doom-scrolling Trade Me and blaming interest rates. No fluff, no webinars, no BS, no guru whispering at you in soft lighting, just hard insight and strategies from people who actually buy property, not just talk about it on LinkedIn. Get the strategy, own the advantage, or keep waiting for Adrian Orr to come save you. Spoiler, he's not. Grab the book. It's in the description below.